I'm Robert Dejarek from Temple University, Japan. Just a few things. In case of an earthquake, the safest thing to do here is actually to go under your chair, because you're always at risk from falling objects, and if need be, we will evacuate to the garden on the other side of the building. Also, if you have a phone, put it on vibrate or silent mode. Brevity is a soul of wit, so I'll just say I'm extremely happy to have my friend and colleague, Professor Kingston, who will brief us on his latest book on religion and Asia, and nationalism in Asia. Do you have a book here to show?
There's a picture there. The guy in the back has a bunch of copies.
Here it is, here it is, here it is. You see the book, let's say. Here it is.
This is what it looks like.
Here it is, let's show it, here it is. Here it is, and you advised to buy it before the end of the show. Here it is, congratulations. Politics of Religion, Nationalism, and Identity in Asia, published by Roman and Littlefeld. Okay, so my first question is, why did you decide to write this book?
Oh, thanks. Before we get there, you're wondering what this PowerPoint is often when you have a book talk, it's like talking about a movie nobody has watched. And so it's a bit of a monologue and people wondering, except Robert and also we have a nice visitor from University of Washington, Doug Miller, who came all the way from Seattle just to see this talk. So we're very honored for your presence. And I guess, teaching, you sometimes when you're discussing the assigned readings, you also have that feeling that you're the only one who did the reading. So to try to even the playing field here, I have selected some excerpts from the book that if you're real bored with what Robert and I are talking about, you can read them, and perhaps that can generate some conversation after we finish. But to Robert's question, why did I do this? Back in 1984, I was a Fulbright student in Indonesia, and I arrived there not long before. There had been a large riot in a place called Tanjung Priok, which is in the port area of Jakarta. I wandered down there, and I was around, talking to people about what was going on, and it had been portrayed in the media as this Islamic extremist uprising. But in talking to the people there, what they seemed most upset about was corruption. Indeed, all over you saw these posters of a Chinese businessman, Lim Su Long, pouring US dollars down the throat of somebody who looked very much like President Suharto. And so it seemed that this was being dressed up as some great Islamic extremist uprising, where it seemed that more or less the people were more concerned about corruption and nepotism. And I was actually doing my field work in a place called Lampung, which is at the southern tip of Sumatra. And I chose it because in history, you either revise what everybody else has said. I didn't have enough confidence about that. So I went for the place that nobody had written about. And there was a good reason. It's essentially a malarial swamp. That's the second reading of Lampung. And I did manage to get malaria there. I did finish my field work. But while I was there, there was also an Islamic uprising, but it wasn't Islamic again. It was basically because the Suharto family had commandeered some plantations for their own family's benefit. So religion was being mobilized for a political agenda to challenge the Suharto's rule. Well, subsequently, I was back in Jakarta, and my neighbors were very devout Muslims, but they were waria, which is they were transvestite prostitutes. And so they greatly improved my command of local Indonesian, and also changed my mind about Islam, because these people saw themselves as true believers, devoted to Islam, and yet most Muslims would not regard them as such. And the interesting thing was that during Ramadan, I was, practicing the fast, and I noticed them all dressing up and going out, and I said, well, how come you're working now during Ramadan? I said, oh, this is our busiest time of the year. So I thought, well, it sort of began to change my thoughts about religion a little bit. And later on, I was in Sitwe in western Burma, the Rakhine state, where they've had the recent Rohingya clearance by the military. And there, I noticed some people who were exceptionally dark-skinned wearing very colorful clothes. And to my shame, I had no idea about the Rohingya then. And so I was talking to some monks, and I said, well, who are these people? Why are they doing this, really, wretched road work in really primitive conditions? And he just, oh, they're the Kalar. As if everybody knows what the Kalar is. Here's a monk saying Kalar. Kalar is a very derogatory word used for people of South Asian ancestry, particularly dark people. He goes, basically, they're like your gypsies. Nobody wants them. So again, I was just thinking, here's a monk. I mean, I wasn't expecting it coming from them. So there are a number of things that have changed my mind. Going to Sri Lanka, and over the last 20 years, I've been there several times. And seeing how Buddhism was at one point mobilized to target the Tamil up in the north. And then once the war was won in 2009, the recent winner of the presidential election, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, was head of the Security Defense Ministry. And he was involved in creating this organization called BBS, Buddhist Power Force, which is run by a firebrand monk named Yanasara. And Yanasara, when I started to interview him, I said, well, what do you think about Trump's, immigration restrictions? And he goes, Trump is a great man. I pray for him every day, but I am even greater than Trump. And then so I'm taping this, and so normally when you're interviewing somebody, you're supposed to sort of keep your game face, but you could hear in the background my guffawing laughing, because I was like, wow, this guy's a real modest sort of monk. So there's all sorts of reasons why this study, crisscrossing Asia for over the last, 35 years, a lot of experiences, lots of reading, and, during the research for a previous book on nationalisms in Asia, I edited one volume, I wrote my own monograph. There's a lot of material that you collect that you couldn't fit in that one, so I thought, okay, well, I'm going to write one just focusing on religion and identity, and clearly looking at what's happened with the Rohingya, what happened last March with the Easter Sunday bombings in Sri Lanka. Clearly, ethno-religious nationalism is a huge issue. And I had an intern here who's working for me, what's it, like 3 or 4 years ago, Mercy. And she was working for me on a project called Islamic Extremism in Bangladesh. And she's Bangladeshi. And she goes, at the beginning of the semester, oh, well, we don't have any. And I said, really? And so anyway, the night of the Holy Bakery bombing, she then texts me, and she actually sort of was fairly closely connected to some of the people involved in that terrorist incident. So these are some of the reasons that I wrote this book. Sorry for such a long-winded answer.
Thanks. And now let me get to the politics of it. What's very striking in your chapter on India and on Hindu-Vitna is you see this conflict between liberty and democracy. It's something that is at the root of the U.S. Constitution, that is very well described in Tocqueville's works, what you call majoritarianism. So could you explain to us how, in a democratic state, religious fanatics, religious extremists can actually take advantage of the system to impose their will on society and on the minority? And that's something that's also relevant to the U.S.
Yeah, I've written a great deal about what I call the malevolent majoritarianism that has gained momentum in Asia over the last 20 years. So rather than sort of a secular democracy, the rule of the majority on behalf of the entire polity, you've had a shift towards majoritarianism where the majority rules in its own interest and imposes this on minorities. And so the emergence of majoritarianism, I think, spells trouble for a lot of these ethnically diverse, religiously diverse societies because the interests of the minorities are not well taken care of. I believe that globalization and the internet have instigated culture wars in many of these societies. And these culture wars bring out the anxieties, angers, and resentment of the majority, and they also feel they're besieged. And so I think that, there's been a process where secular governments like the Congress in India has basically been feckless and ineffective. And I think majoritarian parties like the BJP have taken advantage of that situation. But also, as I write, I think that there's a need among people. The secularism doesn't address the needs of the primordial. I mean, the appeal of hate-mongering and fear-mongering and the presence of the internet where it's sort of a hothouse for stoking the grievances and mobilizing people. I think that this has what's given majoritarianism a lot of momentum in Asia and generally with deleterious consequences.
So does the internet and social media explain or help explain the rise of Hindu nationalism in India?
I think it has intensified the experience of globalization, and I think it's enabled the aggrieved and the vulnerable to share their resentments, their angers, anxieties, and it's sort of an echo chamber of escalating grievance, and so they feed off of each other. So clearly, I think in the case of India, that's true, but I think you can see the same thing, for example, in Myanmar, Indonesia, Myanmar, Indonesia, Bangladesh, India, Sri Lanka, where you have politicians and clerics and religious leaders who are very savvy with social media and know how to whip up the frenzy of the masses. And so we've had a sort of rise of what I call mobocracy.
And does that also explain the rise of, in places like Myanmar and Sri Lanka, of Buddhist extremism?
Yeah, the Buddhist extremist monks are remarkably charismatic. I mean, whether or not you like their message, they're very good at appealing to people. When Ñāṇasara goes to a stadium, it's packed with 40,000 people. He's like one of those fire and brimstone Baptist preachers, those who do evil must be punished. And he clearly knows how to manipulate the people. And he's really good on social media. He has like, 1 million followers in a country of 20 million people. And so when I was waiting to do my interview with him, he was being interviewed for a video. And he's sort of in his full presentation mode, gnashing teeth, screaming invective, And then he finishes that, comes into the office, sits down, and wipes his brow, and calmly sits and talks in a normal voice. You're just like, oh, I guess he can't always be in that sort of frenzied voice. So if you look at Wiratu, look at his videos. He's also incredibly charismatic. And so I think that even though a lot of monks and a lot of Buddhists are very uncomfortable with their extremist message, they do, in a way, make people feel that there is a grave threat to their way of life. And the threat is coming from Islam. And so if you talk to the Buddhists in Myanmar and also in Sri Lanka, they say, the Muslims today are not like the Muslims before. The ones before were simulated, they kept a low profile. The last 20 years now, people are changing their clothing, they're more devout, they're more assertive. And so, in their view, is the wave of Arabization, which has promoted a more devout Salafist sort of Islamic doctrine, is changing the game. And their argument is, look, we Sinhalese, we have one wife, and we have maybe 2 kids. The Muslims, they have 4 wives, and they'll have 15 kids. So there's going to be this demographic tsunami overwhelming us, and so we need to respond. And so Gnanasara told me, he said, look, being a monk doesn't mean, just laying back and passively accepting how things are and sort of meditating. He says, we have to fight back. And he sees himself as a reincarnation of monks from the Kandy era who are mounting a colonial resistance against the British. And he said, look, I'm going to keep fighting this fight until we can say that Sri Lanka is a Sinhalese Buddhist nation. So it doesn't suggest much tolerance for the evident diversity in Sri Lanka.
In Sri Lanka and Myanmar, is the anti-Muslim persecution of the Rohingyas, for example, is that the product of increased Buddhist militancy? Is that the product of increased social dissatisfaction? Is it religiously based? Is it ethnically based? In other words, is there a strong religious component to the persecution of Rohingyas, or is something that could happen in a quote-unquote secular environment, just us versus them, regardless of the religious commitment?
Well, I guess it would be sort of something like all of the above. Clearly, militant monks like Gnanasara Waratu, they, trade in Islamophobia. And they whip people into a very anti-Islamic mode. So even though Wiratu and his followers aren't the ones engaged in the ethnic cleansing, they certainly prepare the public for doing so, and in a sense garner support for that particular agenda. So clearly there's a great deal of destitution in Myanmar, a lot of dissatisfaction. When I went back in 2007, I did a trip of field work in East Timor, and striking the level of poverty I encountered wandering around the mountain areas around there. But then I went to the area above Sitwe near Mrak-U, and wandering in some of those villages of the Rohingya, it was far worse. So yeah, I do think that it's not just religion, but I think religion is very handy to mobilize people and to give people a vocabulary to articulate their Islamophobia. And the monks, in a sense, are urging and instigating. And the military, had several previous practice runs of clearing out the Rohingya. So what happened 2017, 2018, was a culmination of several previous programs. The prior year, they'd had a fairly extensive ethnic clearing operation. And the 2017 ethnic clearing was coincided with the release of the Kofi Annan report that had been commissioned by Aung San Suu Kyi's government. And in it, they recommended that the Rohingya be given citizenship. And exactly the same day, this, heretofore rather unknown terrorist organization called ARSA launches coordinated attacks on military outposts, which the military claims is the basis for what they did afterwards. But ARSA, a ragtag band, a few hundred people, lightly armed, don't represent much of a threat to the state. The Arakan army, however, which the conflict is ongoing, is a totally different matter, but they are Buddhists. And so it's a sort of different situation. But ARSA was an Islamic group. And so they were, in a sense, a convenient target to justify a disproportionate response.
Now, in a place like India, when you look at Hindu chauvinism, it's obviously endogenous because the vast majority of the world's Hindu population is based in India, and to some extent, well, Buddhism, you could, in Burma, I assume it comes mostly from what's happening in Myanmar. You alluded to Arabization and to the more global aspect of the transformation of Islam in Southeast Asia. So to what extent does Arabization, or in particular Saudi Wahhabite influence, affect what has happened in the region, both in Southeast Asia and in South Asia? I'm thinking of Pakistan, for example, and Bangladesh.
Massive influence.
In what
The
sense?
inflow of Saudi money, mosque building, educational programs, funding clerics, they have transformed Islam in the region dramatically over the last 30 years. So the interesting thing about Arabization is that it's changing the character of Islam and Islamic majority nations. When I was living in Indonesia, mid-'80s, hardly anybody wore what we now would consider typical Islamic garb. Now you go there, most people seem to do so. Back in the mid-'80s, there's a great tolerance for sexual and religious minorities. Pretty much gone now. So Arabization, though, is not just the money and the funding, which is extensive. It's also about migrant workers. There's a lot of Bangladeshis and Indonesians who go work in the Middle East. They spend 3 or 4 years, and it changes them. It transforms them in the same way that, for example, going on the Hajj pilgrimage changes people, their relationship with their religion. And so I think that the migrant worker population, when they return, they see themselves as bringing back a purer form of the religion, and they want to promote that at home. And so then, these people are also responding to globalization, and the internet enables them to mobilize people and create networks of the aggrieved and networks of people who agree with this agenda of making society more devout. And in Islamic minority societies, like in Myanmar and in Sri Lanka, the government's reaction is, oh, this is a great threat to our society. These Muslims aren't the Muslims that we've grown used to. And so this more militant Islam, more devout Islam, is seen to be changing the rules of the game. And so I think that that is why you see security forces are clearly linked with the rise of Mabata in Myanmar and with the BBS in Sri Lanka. And so in Sri Lanka, it's a little bit different. Once they defeated the Tamils, they needed a new enemy. And so the Muslims were a convenient scapegoat. In Myanmar, they have no shortage of enemies. I mean, the military is fighting numerous ethnic insurgencies, since the 1950s. But I think it is a way of creating solidarity. And what struck me is going to Myanmar since '92 and knowing a lot of people who identify themselves as liberals and were very anti-military, very pro-Aung Suu Kyi and democratization. When I went there in 2017 in December, and I just come from Dhaka, where there was a very different narrative about the Rohingya, but going then to Yangon, I sort of did the opposite of the Pope Francis tour. Many of these people I've known for years were very much buying the military line, hook, line, and sinker. They were supportive of the ethnic clearance operations. They bought the military's justification that this was necessary to quell the great terrorist threat facing the nation. And I was really surprised by it. I mean, the circling of the wagons, defending the lady, defending the military, that was a big stretch for people like that. And then last December, I went back and total change. And the big difference was the trial of the Reuters reporters. The Reuters reporters had gone to Rakhine, collected evidence about the military and police abuses and killings of Rohingya. And so during the trial, it emerged that the two reporters had been arrested with secret documents. And the police sergeant testified, yes, I was instructed to call them, meet them, plant the documents on them, and then we were going to arrest them. So this is in court. Testify that we framed them, right? And then, the government said, well, yes, but they broke this other Official Secrets Act, that they had information they shouldn't have. And for example, they had the phone numbers of known terrorists. And then, so the known terrorist whose phone number they had said, well, I've never actually talked to these people, and it's not my number anyway. And it turns out that this person had attended an ethnic reconciliation conference hosted by the government, so as a reporter, it would be normal for you to have that number. So I was interviewing the people at Reuters, interviewing the lawyers of the two Reuters reporters. And so this whole narrative that the military had constructed just completely unraveled. And based on the evidence assembled by the Reuters reporters, they actually court-martialed the several military men, not anybody very high, of course, the soldiers, but, so giving a little bit of credibility to the Reuters story. And eventually, earlier this year, they were released from jail. They had been convicted, and the lawyer was incensed by what he believed was Aung San Suu Kyi's unjustified intervention, when twice she publicly said, these people have violated the Official Secrets Act. Right, so that should be a matter for the courts to determine, not the democratic icon that everybody reveres. And so it became extremely awkward and difficult for any of the judges to actually challenge the view that she had given.
A kind of parenthetical question. You mentioned that a lot of Southeast Asian workers who go to Saudi Arabia come back influenced by Saudi Wahhabism. My understanding is that being a foreign worker in Saudi Arabia is a fate one would not wish on one's worst enemy. So how come Southeast Asians return from Saudi Arabia with an admiration rather than a deep-seated hatred for everything which Saudi Arabia stands for?
Well, you're right. Indonesia has actually suspended migration. So there are more than 1 million Indonesians there now, but they've suspended further labor migration there. So it's clear that they do suffer a variety of labor abuses there. But I don't think that they necessarily look at religion as the source of their suffering. And perhaps many of them find solace in religion precisely because they are going through such a very difficult period, and whose shoulder they can lean on. And so in a sense, I think that maybe makes them even more devout.
And we've talked about various religions. What about Christianity in the region? And for example, what has been the role, in one of your chapters you deal with sexual minorities, LGBTQ+. What has been the role of Christians and of Christian churches in the struggle for sexual equality, both between men and women and between sexual minorities?
Yes.
Especially in a place like Taiwan, for example, which has a large Christian population and now has legalized same-sex marriage.
Yeah, going back a little bit. I write about liberation theology and the role of the church in promoting freedom for the East Timorese from Indonesian occupation. I also talk about the church's role in helping to oust Marcos. So since there's a positive role there. And in South Korea, Christianity became a vehicle for anti-colonial agitation. So in many ways, it played a very positive role in these societies. The big story of Christianity in Asia now is Pentecostalism. The charismatic church is, growing exponentially. So there's something like more than 80 million Pentecostals in China, but that was a statistic from, a year and a half ago. So it's probably 100 million by now because things changed dramatically in China. But the Pentecostals there realized that China is one of the least friendly operating environments they're ever going to encounter. And so they're very aware of how the Beijing authorities view religion as a subversive force. And so they go overboard in being extra patriotic, having several portraits of Xi Jinping, and other, luminaries inside the church, and the social media messaging. So in a sense, they want to make space for themselves, but they only feel they can do so by being incredibly patriotic. But what they do is they provide something to these 80, 90 million followers that they don't find in contemporary China. And I imagine it's the grid of order and beliefs that people find wanting in a society that's sort of embracing mammon. Now, in terms of what you're talking about in Taiwan, I've been there several times, encountered Christian demonstrations against the LGBT movement, and they would bus in, tens of thousands of people from southern Taiwan and come agitate against this legislation. And they actually had the end of last year, a referendum in which the Christians mobilized a vote to sort of stop or try to stop LGBT gay marriage, same-sex marriage, things like that. But finally, the Congress acted in this last May. There was a deadline set by the court saying unless you pass legislation by then, we are going to automatically allow same-sex marriage. And so then the legislature got their act together, and they passed this legislation, but it was certainly over the strong objections of the Christian church. So I think also in Singapore you can find many people concerned about Christians' effects on social mores.
And what about blasphemy? You're right about blasphemy. We're all familiar with quote-unquote blasphemy trials in Pakistan. Is blasphemy something that is an issue only in Muslim majority societies in South and Southeast Asia, or is it also something that you see in Buddhist, Hindu, and Christian societies?
I've only found it in Islamic societies. I mean, you have heresy in Christianity, but there isn't much of that going on. But, blasphemy has surged. The allegations of blasphemy have surged over the last 20 years in Pakistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia. And clearly, it is something to do with social media and globalization. I think that these communities feel threatened, so they draw sort of the lines of the acceptable and unacceptable more clearly and defend those lines more assiduously than before. And things that used to be dealt with at a local level are now packaged for mass consumption. And so for clerics in the very busy space of social media, looking to gain a following, accusations of blasphemy are wonderful clickbait and appeal to people. And so blasphemy is not just used to protect religion, it's also used to wreak vengeance, and it's also politicized. For example, the blasphemy campaign against the former governor of Jakarta, this was based on a faked up tape of remarks he made on the campaign trail suggesting he was criticizing Islam. And, then they had large demonstrations on the street run by an Islamic organization. And so in a way you could say, this is Islamic groups sort of trying to challenge the hierarchy and to hold people accountable. But in reality, the Islamic Defenders Front is something of a rent-a-crowd cat's paw of the vested interests. So the former president, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, he wanted his son to become governor, right? So getting this group out on the streets, making the accusations of blasphemy had political purpose. Also, the Islamic Defenders Front had close ties to Prabowo, who was the presidential opponent of Jokowi just this past year and 5 years ago. And so clearly the powerful vested interests are behind the scenes pulling the strings. And so when we see these mobs out there, we like to think of the positive aspects of mobs, like looking at Gwangju in 1980, or looking at the ouster of Marcos in the mid-'80s, or Yangon in '88, or Tiananmen Square '89. So these are positive expressions of mobocracy, which we are also, I guess, seeing in Hong Kong now. And on the other hand, you have mobs that are basically being used by the vested interest. And even in Bangladesh, they even have a term for it, hartal, which essentially means it's part of their political culture. It's like, okay, we can't get what we want at the ballot box, so we're going to try to get what we seek on the streets. And they use these as pressure tactics on the powers that be to modify their policies. And what I see this happening as a result of this is what I call authoritarian creep, meaning that the elected governments resort to actions, policies, regulations to try to stifle these movements. And in doing so, they become increasingly illiberal and authoritarian. And so in order to safeguard secular democracy, they end up betraying the principles of secular democracy. And so in the end, it's a bit of fool's gold.
Let me ask you just two last questions, and then we'll open up for questions. First one is about what you call love jihad. If you could describe to us what this is.
Love jihad is an expression often used in India to refer to Islamic Casanovas who are seducing and converting our women to Islam. And so this is a way to whip up Islamophobia, and so you have Romeo patrols going around trying to make sure that Hindu women aren't going around with Muslim men and trying to prevent conversions. And so this is all sort of ostensibly to protect these women against these Muslim Lotharios who it draws on stereotypes of the sex-crazed Muslim. But in reality, the greatest threat to these Hindu women comes from Hindus, right? I mean, from Eve teasing to, incredible incidents of rape, there's a lot more bad things happening to Hindu women by Hindu men than there are by the imagined threat of Muslims and engaging in love jihad. And so this, I think, is one of the problems of majoritarianism.
And my last question about money.
Money.
Is there money in religion? In other words, what you see, for example, not only in the United States, a lot of countries are members of the clergy using it to enrich themselves. Are a lot of these religious entrepreneurs in South Asia and Southeast Asia into it just to get rich?
Well, if there's money in religion, I mean, look at the Vatican, and obviously there can be money in religion. There's money in trimming your sails to the wave of Saudi financing. So if you want to have a mosque built, a cleric appointed, you want to get a scholarship to go to Saudi Arabia. So certainly that has a way of influencing people. When I visited Janasara at his temple, I saw a rather nice BMW parked outside, and I don't think it was the car of any of his parishioners or servants there. So I guess some people do okay. Clearly, in Thailand, many of the monks have done a bit more than okay.
Well, thank you. So now we are open to Q&A. So if you have a question, raise your hand, and Jeff will recognize you, and then you'll go to the mic in the back right so that we can hear you and record the question. So.
Hello. You touched on Indonesian politics when you mentioned Jokowi and Prabowo. And this last election, their rivalry was very fierce. But recently, Jokowi appointed Prabowo as the Minister of Defense. So what do you think are the implications of that political move? what's going to happen in the next term?
Well, I think it's also interesting, his vice presidential candidate of Jokowi was the cleric who issued the fatwa against Ahok, right? So clearly, Jokowi was running a defensive campaign, protecting his flanks by having an ardent Islamicist as his running mate. There was the old adage, keep your friends close, your enemies closer. So perhaps bringing Prabowo into the cabinet was an astute move. Maybe it's going to help Jokowi achieve something, because the problem is when you are a lame duck president, it's harder to get things done. But by bringing Prabowo in, that's going to change the balance of power in Parliament in Jokowi's favor. So maybe that will be positive for his agenda,
Thank you.
which I think is principally economic development.
Hi, I'm Meredith Shaw from the University of Tokyo. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about your justification of your case selection, or your kind of framework of writing this book about nationalism and identity in Asia, as you put it. Are you saying that there's something universal to nationalism in Asia that's different from nationalisms in other parts of the world? Because it seems to me like you're talking about a lot of different countries where a lot of different nationalisms are happening, and not having read the book yet, I don't know if you go into this or is it just that these are the cases that you know and therefore you're writing about nationalism in Asia because that's what you're familiar with, or are you trying to say something broader about what this particular nationalism that we find in Asia that we don't find anyplace else? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not arguing it's distinctive in Asia. You're right, it is based on cases that I know about. And so it's not saying, oh, Asian nationalism is different than European nationalism. I'm just looking at how the intersection of nationalism, politics, identity, and religion in Asia, and that volatile mix, how it's working out, and helping in a way to offer a contrasting view about what's often touted as the onward and upward Asian century. And a lot of people are very concerned about the potential for international conflict between nations in Asia. There's a lot of flashpoints. But in fact, I think the greater threat is within these nations. And the rise of majoritarianism, I think, is a grave threat to minorities, and it's provoking a backlash. And so I see this rise of ethno-religious nationalism as being more of an inward-directed threat than an outward threat. But no, it's not particularly unique.
Thank you.
Good evening. From the excerpt of your book where it mentions about Christianity in South Korea, as well as anti-colonial perspectives, would one of those examples be protesting against United States military bases and their involvement in South Korea?
Well, I don't think that that is the unique preserve of Christians. I think there are a number of Koreans, for various reasons, who are against the American bases there. For example, it's about 15 years ago, just on the eve of the presidential elections, some American soldiers ran over some schoolgirls and hit and run. And so that changed the entire election campaign, so that the current president's mentor, No Roon-hoon, he won that election principally because of anger directed against the American military presence. So I think, like in Japan, there's mixed feelings. So many people feel very positive about the American presence here, others don't. I think if you go to Okinawa, perhaps the feeling is more anti than pro. So I don't think Christianity is necessarily the basis for anti-American sentiments in Korea, but it was certainly a key force in the anti-Japanese colonial movement.
All right. it's just an observation that when I was spending time as an American soldier in South Korea, 2 out of the 3 protests I've observed, the majority were Christian organized or organized by a Christian group. So I'm just like to have more insight on that. Thank you.
Every time I go to Korea, I'm always struck by how many demonstrations there are all the time by various groups. I mean, if there's a ranking of demonstrating societies, I think South Korea would be right at the top. So, I mean, there's workers' strikes, there's anti-American demonstrations, there's anti-moon, there's Sewol ferry demonstrations. So, you know, the contrast is here, where everything seems so quiet and calm and restrained, and then you go to Korea, it's like, wow, it's big contrast. Thank you. Ken?
Siegfried Knittel, freelancer from Germany. What role does shall I say, the complexity of modernity play in the in the Asian countries? The traditional values are overwhelmed by liberal values, and from the social media, they bring a different kind of thinking to these countries. And what does it mean for the people? Is this one reason perhaps looking for a simple or solution for the social problems, or what? Yeah.
Well, I don't think there's any single response to that, but you're right. I do think that globalization is, in a way, seen to be sabotaging, subverting prevailing norms and values, cultural traditions in these societies. And so the backlash against that, I think we see ethno-religious nationalism is, in a sense, defending against this, you know, onslaught. And so that also then mixes in with, you know, the influx of Arabization and sort of more assertive, devout form of Islam, which plays out rather differently in Islamic majority societies and Islamic minority societies, but elicits similar responses. So it is very complex, but I do feel that we are living in what Pankaj Mishra calls the age of anger. He refers to the ressentiment, the envy that people feel. And so I think that the internet confronts people very viscerally with what they don't have and can't have. And that creates anger. And I think that the internet is a great sort of force multiplier that gives these, you know, keyboard trolls a great deal of power. And the social media has taken the keys away from the traditional gatekeepers, so that anybody who has access to a phone, you know, can mount these, you know, escalating cyber attacks and gain a following. And so I think there are many different responses to modernization, and it can't sort of generalize across countries, but I do think that this is certainly one element in what we're witnessing in the region.
Thanks a lot, Jeff. This is Ken Moskowitz from Temple University. You painted a very disturbing picture, and I was thinking about the internet and social media because, just reflecting on it, other people have mentioned it, that it's the language of outrage. The text and the video is very persuasive. There's no gatekeepers, as you said. There's no fact-checking, as in newspapers, so there's a lot of misinformation or fake news. So it's a disturbing trend in the US too, and there are parallels, I think, in other continents. But what tools or what strategies do you imagine liberals, moderates, you know, people who are not inflamed by these tensions would have to counter the discussions on the internet or the just general political discourse given these trends?
So far it seems this is what is authoritarian creep. You know, illiberal policies aim to stifle and repress. I think people don't really know how to respond. And so, you know, Myanmar is a perfect example. Until 2012, you know, they don't have mobile phone networks. After 2012, suddenly ramps out, and Facebook becomes the social media of choice. And, you know, there's clear evidence that, you know, the generals and their henchmen clearly planted fake news on Facebook on numerous different accounts. They use these to also discredit the critics of the Rohingya operations. So, you know, it is a case where hate mongering, Islamophobia, justification of ethnic clearing, all these things were happening, you know, after 2012, not beforehand. And so I think that social media has a lot to answer for. I don't think anybody really right now has any good answers when Facebook is, you know, carrying ads that clearly are conveying inaccurate information and saying, that's not our job. You know, but in Myanmar, they have made a huge change because it came out in post 2017 that they had 3 Burmese language experts monitoring a country with 80 million people. So now apparently they've got 20. So, of course, it's a mission impossible to catch up. So, you know, I guess to what extent would people accept controls over social media to vet that, and where do you draw the line? China draws a line one place. I don't know whether the rest of Asia would look at the Great Firewall as an example to emulate.
Good evening, Professor. Thank you very much for your insightful sharing on a wide-ranging areas in Asia. Earlier in your talk, you painted a kind of a sobering picture of democracy in Asia, saying that there's malevolent majoritarianism gaining momentum. And I was wondering if you could comment briefly about the situation in Japan and your assessment about how democracy in Japan is working out so far, and whether, in a response to the earlier question, you mentioned that things are relatively quiet compared to South Korea. But what I had in mind was like student movements against during the collective self-defense debates in 2015. I was wondering if you could comment on how that might be an indication of like how democracy is functioning in Japan like today and in the foreseeable future. And if it's okay, I'd like to ask a second question about earlier you mentioned Singapore and Christianity in a bit of a passing comment, but you mentioned that Christianity might have a growing influence on the social mores of Singapore. I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on that. Thank you very much.
Well, that's the easier one, so I'll just get that one out. I meant that they are campaigning against LGBT rights. And so you've seen, for example, in Singapore, they used to have, you know, sort of a gay pride festival, and now foreigners are excluded and only island residents are allowed to attend that. I don't think that's only because of the Christians, but I do think that many activists in Singapore rue the influence of Christians there. As for the state of Japanese democracy, well, that's a real big one. It was as Yoshida said, demo kurushi. It's difficult. You've seen, for example, in the recent issue of The Economist, you know, they talked about how Japan has an unfair, disproportionate election system that is biased in favor of the ruling party. And on a number of occasions, the Supreme Court has said that this electoral system is in a state of unconstitutionality, which, you know, I don't know exactly what that means. It's sort of like being pregnant without being pregnant. So it's a state of unconstitutionality. So the overrepresentation of rural electorates definitely rigs the system in favor of the LDP. In terms of the state of politics, democratic politics in Japan, look at the situation in Okinawa, where the Abe administration is continuing with efforts to build the Henoko airport, even though over 70% of the island's residents in a referendum held in February voted against it, and only 19% for it. So it seems that the democratic voice of the Okinawans is rather awkward, and it does sort of indict the, you know, the nostrum that is always rolled out. The U.S.-Japan alliance is based on shared values, except apparently democracy is not one of those. You know, I guess a number of people might know that I've never been accused of being a big fan of the Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. You know, he's won a number of elections, so kudos to him for that. He does go through the normal means, and so, you know, Japan's democracy is functioning. If you look around the region, it's doing better than many others. As for the SEALs demonstrations, I attended a number of their demonstrations back in 2015, and I was really, you know, pleasantly surprised, because I think for a long time you felt, how come the Japanese people are so quiet and putting up with all this and not getting angry? There's so much to be angry about. Whereas, you know, South Korea, of course, everybody's demonstrating all the time, right? So the big contrast. And even like, you know, after Fukushima, I mean, the protests were there, but they were rather limited. And so the SEALs seemed, you know, they were first incarnation, they're, you know, demonstrating against the state secrets law. And then they're demonstrating against Abe's sort of end around the Constitution by reinterpreting unilaterally Article 9 allows for collective self-defense. And the interesting thing is Abe signs the U.S.-Japan defense guidelines in the spring of 2015, and only later then consults with the Japanese Diet about actually, you know, passing legislation that would allow Japan to do what it already committed to do. Doesn't that strike you as sort of an odd set of priorities? That prioritizing sort of the client state role of doing what Uncle Sam wants, and then going to the Japanese side and say, look, can you guys pass this legislation because we've already signed on the dotted line? But clearly 80% of the people at the time were against that legislation. And if you look at every one of Abe's signature policies, majority of the people are against them. But yet, he's got the majority in the Diet, and he can get his legislation through, which gets back to the beginning, is the election system is biased and rigged in favor of the ruling party. And only half of the people vote. And Abe and his party win about half of the half. So they don't really have much of a mandate. They get around 1/4 of the potential electorate, but yet they win these landslide victories and 2/3 majorities. So even though the state of democracy in Japan is better than a lot of other countries, and coming from the United States, I'm certainly in no position to cast stones at this point. You know, I do think there is certainly room for improvement.
Thank you very much.
Actually, you know, on the rural-urban difference in Japan, I think the House ratio is 1-3. But in the US, it can be 1-35 or 1-40, because if you look at the Senate, there are states that have fewer than 1 million inhabitants that have 2 senators, and California, which has over 35 million inhabitants, also has 2. So the ratio is actually much fairer in Japan than it is in the US and in some other societies.
Yeah, well, not to get into the U.S. political situation, but I think that the original deal was that when they created the United States, they had the Senate system to reassure the smaller states that their interest would be represented. So I don't think it was initiated to rig the system in favor of one particular party,
No, but
even if it has worked out that way.
That's what it's become. And I think also when you mentioned that only half vote in Japan, the half that doesn't vote because it decides not to vote. I don't think there's the extent of voter suppression in Japan that there has been against African Americans in some US states. I mean, Japanese who decide not to vote on election day aren't voting because they have other priorities, as Dick Cheney said about Vietnam.
And perhaps they're discouraged because they don't think it will make much of a difference anyway. And all the elections are fought on really boring things like Abenomics. You know, what I really want to do is pass, you know, revision of Article 9. He doesn't campaign on that. He campaigns on Abenomics. It's not yet working, but we're going to rev it up, and it will eventually work. So, you know, I'd say that, yeah, it's not like voter suppression in America, but it's like encouraging voter apathy and people tuning out, turning off.
With the widespread proliferation of social media in the Philippines, to the point where many local governments use Facebook pages in lieu of actually creating their own websites, wouldn't that create a precedence in which Facebook, a private entity that is outside of the Philippines, have a large amount of leverage and control over public Filipino functions in the government?
It certainly does give them a great deal of power and influence and leverage, and certainly there are reasons to be concerned about how responsibly it's been using that influence.
And also going off of that, wouldn't that also create a catalyst for like toxic internet social media behavior that would lead towards Filipino government functions?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of toxicity on social media. It's not just Facebook, but I think it's a medium that lends itself to that.
All right, thank you very much.
Douglas Miller, University of Washington, also Temple University. Thanks for your talk. I wholly disagree with your assessment of Japanese democracy, but we'll talk about that over coffee sometime. I wanted to touch upon the concept of malevolent majoritarianism. So you've sort of used both majoritarianism and mobocracy at the same, in the same context of the book. And to me, I'm not a big fan of hyphenated ideologies, but when something is malevolent, there's a collective intent by the majority. And somewhere along the line, when I'm listening to you talk about social media and the clerics and so on and so forth, it almost feels like there's a loudest minority that is leading, like the Netoyo, basically, in Japan. Now, how do you reconcile this malevolent majoritarianism concept with a mobocracy that's basically being stoked by the loudest minority in these countries?
I don't see them as being inconsistent, that the majoritarianism means that you are asserting the rights and privileges and benefits of the majority at the expense of the minorities.
Right.
And so the mobocracy is part of that. The internet is part of that. That's how they mobilize people and whip up support for the majoritarian agenda. And they use minorities as scapegoats for what ails the society, even though it may be bizarre and outlandish what they're arguing. So that I see that it doesn't mean that the majority of people have that intent, but it's the leaders of majoritarianism do have that intent.
Right.
And they use the weapons at hand to ensure that happens.
Right, and so it's not really majoritarianism, right?
No, it is majoritarianism. Majoritarianism doesn't mean what the majority decides. Majoritarianism means that the ethnic or religious majority of a particular society, their interests, their benefits are being privileged by the ruling elite. So it doesn't mean that everybody who's being whipped up is intending to do this, but the people who are doing the whipping up, who are mobilizing them in support of their agenda, do have these intentions.
Right.
So majoritarianism isn't like, everybody who is supportive of the national majority is in line with those agendas, but they are being pulled into and mobilized because, hey, your interests are going to be privileged over everybody else's. And look, we're going after the Muslims of Kashmir, and we're going after the Muslims of Assam. So we got your back.
Or so.
And so, just because everywhere else is a total failure, there's all this destitution and inequalities and everything else is going wrong, hey, we got it better than those guys.
Okay.
Look forward to coffee and unraveling the pathologies of Japanese democracy.
Hi, Jeff.
Hi there.
Nancy Snow. I'm a fellow here at ICAS, and I also teach at Kyoto Gaidai. I, earlier this year, was at the headquarters of Facebook, where I met Maria Ressa, the CEO of Rappler. And it was really surreal to be in that environment because Facebook, of course, is under fire now and under scrutiny that we need to break up these media companies, which, by the way, they don't refer to themselves as any kind of media company. They're just a platform, a distributor of information. But she was recently interviewed on 60 Minutes. I don't know if anybody saw it. But it sort of got me wondering about, in this age of social media, there's so much good that's come out of it, but also it's such a mixed bag. And I really, I had sort of a dystopian view of Facebook after visiting the headquarters, even though I'm still on Facebook. Maybe I won't be after these remarks. But I'm just wondering, do you have any position on breaking up these major tech companies, or sort of like Elizabeth Warren has been out there and getting some hurrahs on that somewhat, but it's gigantic. If anybody has ever, if you get a chance to go there, you've got to see it. It's like a huge university campus. I'm talking about Facebook. So I'm just wondering, what is your position on these major social media? Because there hasn't been any real, as far as I can see, real movement away. People getting off of that and going to something like Oryu, which is this kind of socially good alternative called Humanity or You. I mean, their numbers are not going through the roof. So what's your perspective? Is it just try to do some of your own good? Because as with Ressa, I mean, she's using the platform as much as she was formerly with CNN, but she's a critic of Duterte using a platform that many of us still find authoritarian in its own right. So it's all sort of complex to me.
Yeah, I haven't really given thought about what to do about the menace, but clearly there is a menace. I think that social media is an accelerant that is igniting the embers of anger, and given all the dry kindling of discontent in Asia, that's a volatile situation. But you're right, Rappler is a wonderful example of the good that come out of having social media, and it is a way to bypass the gatekeepers. It's a way not to be beholden to advertisers. And so, she couldn't do what she's doing in exposing the sins of the Duterte administration without it. So it can do a lot of good. But then we look at so many other examples where it tends to provide great power to people who don't have good intentions like that. And so I think that those with good intentions get overwhelmed because she's essentially just saying, hey, he's a really corrupt and bad guy, and here's all these examples. Whereas the baddies are out there, hey, this is the enemy, let's go get them. And so the consequences of the negative aspects of social media, I think, are much worse than the good that can be achieved by positive examples like Maria Ressa. But I didn't see that 60 Minutes interview. I have to see if I can find that.
Yeah, I would highly recommend people to watch that because she's such a risk taker. She's not the only one, but it's very inspiring. I'm not sure I would have that nerve that
she's
she
probably going to be going to
continues
jail.
have. I know.
I mean, Duterte's got the courts rigged, and she's sort of definitely in their sights. So she's stepped on some big toes.
Yeah. Thank you.
But that's
Yeah,
why she's such a good journalist.
that's right.
And that's an inspiration, I think, to other journalists, that if you don't take risks, if you don't sort of hold the powerful accountable, then you're not really doing your job. So I just finished editing a book on press freedom in contemporary Asia. It'll come out next month. Hey, another chance to hucksterism here. And we have one... Huh?
Another chance to speak it to you, Jay.
And our correspondent, the author from Kashmir, we're going through the proofs just in August, when beginning of August is when the Modi government pulled the plug on the internet in Kashmir. And so we're like, oh God, what are we going to do? He can't go through the proofs. But I just sent it to his normal email, and somebody else picked it up and somehow got around. So there's always ways to work around these things. So an uplifting, positive story there. But in general, I don't think that the media in India has much of a positive story about it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Jay. I'm an undergraduate at the Tokyo International University. First of all, thank you very much for your talk today. And as somebody's already mentioned, you gave a very sobering account of contemporary Asian issues, that security issues come from within rather than outside of the nation itself. And my questions would be kind of related to the title of your books, The Politics of Religion, Nationalism, and Identity in Asia, and that, as the name implies, it's politics, right? And so my question is that this rising phenomenon of majoritarian rules and kind of ethnic violence, is it something grassroots that's coming from the bottoms, or is it something that state agents co-opt the state apparatus to kind of incite violence?
I don't think it's grassroots, but there are a lot of problems at the grassroots, and these problems can then be tapped into by invoking religion, and sort of people with political agendas essentially wrap themselves in the shawl of the sacred to promote their temporal agendas. And so I think that religion is a convenient way to work people up, to give them a language of grievance and a language of seeking restitution and revenge. And so it makes sacred what is essentially a political ploy by people who are trying to pursue different agendas. So at the grassroots, for example, in Bangladesh, in the rural areas, the state doesn't provide social services, right? But Saudi-funded mosques and clerics do. So if you are beholden to these people, you're loyal to them. And so in a way you could say the problems of the grassroots then can be addressed by religious leaders who provide you solace and they provide you, hope. But they also are using these people to pursue their own agendas. And the same thing, for example, with Mabata in Myanmar. I interviewed a monk who said, Waratu is the worst thing that ever happened to Mabata. I mean, he's like the heavy metal rock star of Mabata, and he gets all the coverage and notoriety. But this other monk said, he's a disaster because people think we're all a bunch of raving Islamophobics, but we are that. But we also do a lot of other stuff. So he said, we're the ones who are going out in rural areas, providing education, giving people access to health care. So we're much more than that hate mongering. But because of him, that's all people think that we're doing. Whereas the case in the counterpart organization, Sri Lanka, they don't do anything else except hate mongering. But when I interviewed Yanasara, he said, from now on, that's our first 5 years, we did our hate mongering. From now on, we're going to do our social welfare program. And the next month, he was on the run because he had incited a riot in eastern Sri Lanka. And now his star is rising because his patron has just become president again. And the Easter Sunday bombings have put wind in his sails. So, I'm skeptical about the notion that the grassroots is leading the elite. I think it's the other way around, and I think that social media provides them great access to sort of the commanding heights and to control the masses to support their agendas.
And also following from that, how then would globalization play into this dynamics?
Because globalization is undermining their values, their norms, their traditions. Globalization is creating gathering disappointments. for the people who are uprooted and deracinated and marginalized by globalization, and because of the internet, they're confronted increasingly with what they don't have and what they can't have. I think the internet is essentially creating a reservoir of people who are ready to listen to some message that the clerics can deliver, say, if you follow me, this is what we need to do. We need to purge our society. The evil must be punished. The righteous will rise.
Right.
That sort of messaging.
So in a way, it also comes from the bottoms, kind of the catalyst as globalization, which uprooted these people, which make them kind of prime for these kind of narrative to have influence on them.
Yes, so they add to the accumulation of dry kindling in societies waiting for the match.
Right.
And that match is struck by the clerics and the militant monks.
Thank you.
Ignite the fire. And the one question before about seals, I didn't get to. The thing about seals is after the upper house elections in 2017 basically disbanded because it didn't have a powerful impact, didn't realize its goals. But I understand is since then, people who were active in the SEALs movement have been punished and finding it harder to get jobs. They're sort of like blacklisted in Japanese society, which I guess is another blemish on Japanese democracy. Anyway, thank you for your question.
Thank you very much.
Good evening. Thank you very much. I'm Stefan Heb from University of Geneva in Switzerland. I would like to hear you on your concept of religion as an analytic category for social analysis. I'm writing and speaking in a European language. So the concept of religion, it seems to me, captures something very hard to capture. It has aspects of well, metaphysical and moral beliefs. There's a form of social organization attached to it as well. And so it's lots of things going together, and I'm sometimes not that convinced that it's actually a universal, that it can serve as a universal category for social analysis around the globe. I wonder to what extent you problematize that, or you think that is a relatively neglectable and it can be, pragmatically it can be applied without very much problems, or if it is a real issue and how you have dealt with that. Thank you.
It is a real issue, but I don't problematize it because I'm focusing on the politics of religion, not sort of what you're talking about is more the spirituality, the emotions, the inner side of religion, where I'm talking about how religion is manipulated for political purpose. So in the sense that you're talking about, I don't problematize it. I try to see how other people are using religions and trying to endow their temporal agendas with sort of a sacred cloak.
If I may, still to understand how you define religion. What is religion in your view?
Well, that's a hard question, but I guess at one level I just accept that Christianity is a religion, Islam is a religion, Buddhism is a religion, and Hinduism is a religion. So it's where people have common beliefs, common symbols, common understandings, and these in some way appeal to the spiritual needs of the followers. But again, what is religion is not my concern here. I'm more interested in how people use religion for political purposes and how they try to endow their temporal agendas with the sacred, so that it doesn't really matter what religion is. It matters that the people who are believers and devoted to a religion are not only being led by their gods or by their beliefs, but they are being led by the scoundrels and charlatans and zealots who take advantage of them. But anyway, thank you very much for coming, and it's been an interesting session. And if any of you are interested at the back. They're selling copies of this at some wildly huge discount, so please avail yourselves. And Christmas is coming up soon, so this book is a great Christmas stocking stuffer. Anyway, thank you very much.